Everyone laughed when a little girl buried rotten fruit in her backyard. They pointed fingers. They shook their heads. They called her names that no child should ever hear. But she kept digging. She kept planting. She kept believing in something that nobody else could see. And then they saw her jungle, in the heart of Dusty Hollow, Oklahoma, where the sun baked the earth into cracked clay and the wind carried more sorrow than rain. There lived a girl named Elara Whitfield. She was 9 years old, barely tall enough to see over the kitchen counter, with freckles scattered across her nose like someone had flicked cinnamon from the heavens. Her hair was the colour of wheat fields in late summer, always tied back in two lopsided braids that her mother did her best to tame each morning before the bus came rattling down the dirt road. Dusty Hollow was the kind of town that time had forgotten, or perhaps had simply given up on. The main street had 3 buildings that still had roofs, and 2 of those were held together by prayers and rusted nails. The grocery store, if you could call it that, sold canned goods with labels so faded you couldn't tell if you were buying peaches or peas until you opened the can. The school had 23 students total, spanning kindergarten through 8th grade, all crammed into a single room with a wood stove that smoked more than it warmed. But the worst thing about Dusty Hollow wasn't the poverty. It wasn't the boarded-up windows or the abandoned cars sitting on cinder blocks in every other yard. The worst thing was the soil. The ground had turned against the people who lived on it. What had once been farmland, rich, dark earth that could grow corn taller than a man, had become something closer to concrete. Years of drought, years of overuse, years of chemicals poured onto the land in desperate attempts to force it to yield, had stripped the soil of everything that made it alive. The dirt was grey. It was hard. It was dead. And in a town where the dirt was dead, hope didn't last much longer. Elara's family was no different from the rest. Her father, Jed Whitfield, had been a farmer once, back when the land still remembered how to grow things. He had broad shoulders and hands like leather. Hands that had once turned soil and planted seeds with the confidence of a man who believed the earth would always provide. Now those same hands spent their days fixing other people's trucks at the garage on Route 9, coming home with grease under his fingernails and a silence that filled the house heavier than any words could. Her mother, Clara, had been a schoolteacher before the school district cut funding and turned Dusty Hollow Elementary into a single-room operation. Now she worked the register at the grocery store, smiling at customers who had nothing to smile about, counting pennies and dimes into the till, while her dreams of shaping young minds gathered dust on a shelf she couldn't reach anymore. They lived in a small house at the end of Elm Street. The last house before the road turned to nothing but scrub and sagebrush. The backyard was a rectangle of hard-packed clay, maybe 30 feet by 40, surrounded by a fence that leaned to the left as if the wind had been pushing it that way for years. There was an old oak tree in the corner, half dead itself, its branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers begging for mercy. This was the world Elara was born into. A world where nothing grew. A world where dreams came to die. A world where a little girl with braids and freckles was expected to accept her fate, to grow up and move away or stay and wither like everything else in Dusty Hollow. But Elara Whitfield was not like other children. She saw things differently. Where others saw dead earth, she saw possibility. Where others saw the end, she saw a beginning waiting to happen. And where others saw rotten fruit, the discarded, the useless, the forgotten, she saw life itself, sleeping, waiting for someone brave enough to wake it up. It started on a Tuesday in late August, the kind of day when the heat shimmered off the pavement and the air felt thick enough to chew. Elara was walking home from the grocery store with her mother, carrying a paper bag that held their meagre supplies, a loaf of bread, a can of beans, and 2 apples that had seen better days. The apples were soft, their skin wrinkled like old men's faces, and they smelled of fermentation. That sweet sour scent that meant they were one day away from turning to mush. As they passed the alley behind the hardware store, Elara noticed something that made her stop in her tracks. There, spilling out of a tipped garbage can, was a pile of rotting produce. Bananas blackened beyond recognition. Oranges covered in blue-green mold. Peaches that had dissolved into something unrecognizable. And tomatoes. So many tomatoes, split open and leaking seeds like tiny jewels into the dirt. Elara, come on, her mother called, already 10 steps ahead. It's too hot to stand around. But Elara couldn't move. She was staring at those tomatoes, at the way their seeds had fallen onto the cracked concrete of the alley, at the tiny patch of dampness where the fruit's juices had pooled. And in that dampness, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it, was a speck of green, a sprout. No bigger than a thread, no taller than a whisper, but undeniably alive. Something inside Elara's chest tightened, then swelled. If a tomato seed could grow in the crack of an alley, in the worst possible conditions, with no soil and no care, and nothing but rot to sustain it, then what could grow in her backyard? What could happen if someone actually tried? She didn't say anything to her mother. She knew better. Adults in Dusty Hollow had stopped believing in miracles a long time ago. But that night, after her parents had gone to bed, and the house was quiet, except for the creak of the old oak tree outside her window, Elara crept out of bed and went to the kitchen. She found the 2 wrinkled apples in the fruit bowl, the ones her mother had planned to throw away in the morning. She took them. She took a spoon from the drawer, and she slipped out the back door into the moonlight. The backyard was silver in the darkness, the dead earth looking almost beautiful in the pale glow. Elara walked to the centre of the yard, where the oak tree cast the deepest shadows, and she began to dig. The ground was hard, harder than she expected, and the spoon bent almost immediately. But she didn't stop. She used her fingers, scraping and clawing at the clay, until she had made a hole no bigger than her fist. She dropped the apples in, she covered them with dirt, and she whispered, "Grow." Then she went back to bed, her fingernails caked with dust, her heart beating like a drum in her ears, feeling for the first time in her life like she had done something that mattered. The next morning, she was up before the sun. She ran to the backyard in her nightgown, barefoot, not caring about the cold dew on her feet. She looked at the spot where she'd buried the apples. Nothing. Just the same hard grey dirt, the same dead earth, the same nothing that had always been there. But Elara wasn't discouraged. She had seen that sprout in the alley. She knew that growth took time, that it happened underground, in secret, where nobody could see it, that the most important work was always invisible at first. So she waited, and she watched, and she planned. Over the next few days, Elara became a collector of the forgotten. She scavenged the alleys behind the grocery store and the diner, finding discarded fruit that the town had deemed worthless. She rescued bananas that had turned completely black, their insides soft as pudding. She gathered oranges with white fur growing on their peels. She collected peaches that dissolved in her hands, their nectar dripping between her fingers like honey. She even found a pineapple once, its crown still green, but its body bruised and leaking. And she buried that too, Wondering what tropical magic might wake up in the Oklahoma clay, she buried them all. In the center of the backyard, she dug hole after hole, each one small but significant, each one a promise to the earth that she hadn't given up on it. She worked in the early mornings before the heat became unbearable, and in the evenings when the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded her of the fruit she was planting. Her knees were permanently stained brown. Her fingernails never came completely clean. And her heart was fuller than it had ever been. Her mother noticed the dirt on her nightgowns. Her father noticed the spoon that had been bent into a strange curve. But they didn't say anything. In Dusty Hollow, children found their own ways to cope with a world that offered so little. If Elara wanted to play in the dirt, let her play in the dirt. At least she was outside. At least she was moving. At least she wasn't staring at a screen or getting into trouble. But the other children in town weren't so understanding. It was Billy Kincaid who saw her first. Billy was 12, the oldest kid in the one-room schoolhouse, and he had made it his personal mission to make life miserable for anyone smaller or weaker than him. He was already nearly 6 feet tall, with arms like tree branches and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same hard clay as the Dusty Hollow soil. He was riding his bike past the Whitfield house one Saturday morning when he saw Elara in the backyard, kneeling in the dirt with a rotting watermelon in her arms. The watermelon was enormous, split down the middle, its pink flesh turning grey and its seeds spilling out like black tears. "What are you doing, weirdo?" Billy called out, stopping his bike at the fence. Elara looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Planting," she said simply. "Planting?" Billy laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the empty street. "You can't plant rotten fruit, dummy. It's dead, just like everything else in this stupid town." "It's not dead," Elara said quietly. "It's sleeping." Billy threw his head back and laughed louder. "Sleeping? Hey everyone, come look at the fruit girl. She's burying garbage in her yard because she thinks it'll grow." Within minutes, half the kids from school had gathered at the fence. Tommy Grimes, who always followed Billy around like a shadow. The Miller twins, who never did anything separately. Even Sarah Jenkins, who Elara had once considered a friend, stood there with her arms crossed and a smirk on her face. "Fruit girl! Fruit girl!" They chanted, their voices rising and falling like a cruel song. "Elara the fruit girl, planting garbage in the dirt!" Elara felt her face grow hot, felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. But she didn't stop. She placed the watermelon in the hole she'd dug, covered it with soil, and patted it down gently, like she was tucking a child into bed. "You're all crazy," Billy said, shaking his head. "My dad says this town is cursed. Nothing grows here, nothing ever will. You're just making yourself look stupid." "Maybe," Elara said, standing up and brushing the dirt from her knees. "But I'd rather look stupid trying than smart doing nothing." Billy didn't have a response to that. He just snorted, climbed back on his bike, and rode away, his gang following behind him like ducklings. But the name stuck. By Monday morning, everyone at school was calling her Fruit Girl. The teachers heard it, but didn't stop it. In a town with 23 students, maintaining order was more about survival than education. And if the kids needed a target for their frustrations, the teachers weren't going to stand in their way. The mockery got worse. Kids would leave rotten fruit on her desk, a mushy banana, a mouldy orange, with notes that said, "Plant this, fruit girl." They would follow her home from the bus stop, chanting their cruel song, throwing pebbles at her back. Billy Kincaid started a rumour that Elara was eating the rotten fruit. that she was so poor her family couldn't afford fresh food, that she was digging through garbage because she was starving. None of it was true, of course. The Whitfields were poor, like everyone in Dusty Hollow, but they weren't starving. Elara's mother made sure there was always something on the table, even if it was just beans and bread. But truth didn't matter to children who needed someone to hurt. And Elara, with her dirty knees and her faraway eyes and her strange obsession with decay, was the perfect target. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Elara wasn't just burying fruit. She was studying it. She had found an old book in the school library, a tattered volume called The Secrets of Soil that had been donated 20 years ago by someone who had long since left Dusty Hollow. The book was missing its cover and half its pages, but what remained changed everything. Elara thought she knew about growing things. She learned that rotting fruit wasn't waste. It was transformation. When fruit decomposed, it released nutrients back into the soil. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, all the things that dead earth needed to remember how to be alive again. The mold and the fungus that grew on rotting fruit weren't destroyers. They were builders, breaking down complex molecules into simple ones that plants could absorb. The seeds inside the fruit, even old ones, could remain dormant for years, waiting for the right conditions to germinate. And most importantly, she learned that soil wasn't just dirt. It was a living thing, a community of billions of microorganisms that worked together to create life. When soil died, when it was stripped of organic matter, when chemicals killed the bacteria and fungi, when drought baked it into clay, it could be revived. But it needed help. It needed organic matter. It needed time. And it needed someone who believed in its potential. Elara became that someone. Every morning before school, she would water her backyard with a watering can she'd found in the shed. The bottom rusted through, but still functional. If she didn't fill it too full. The water was precious. The town's well was running low, and everyone was rationing. But Elara used only what she needed, just enough to keep the buried fruit damp enough to decompose. Every afternoon after school, she would sit in the backyard with her book, reading the same pages over and over, memorizing the words about composting and soil regeneration and the miracles that could happen when you worked with nature instead of against it. She started a journal, writing down everything she observed: the temperature, the moisture level, the way the soil felt under her fingers, the number of earthworms she spotted, the color changes she noticed in the clay. And slowly, so slowly that she almost missed it, things began to change. It started with the smell. After 3 weeks of burying fruit, the backyard began to smell different. Instead of the dry, dusty scent of dead earth, there was something else, something rich and earthy and alive. It smelled like the forest Elara had read about in books, like damp leaves and fresh soil and possibility. Then came the insects. Not the usual flies that buzzed around garbage, but earthworms. Fat, pink earthworms that surfaced after she watered, wriggling through the damp soil like nature's own ploughs. Elara had read about earthworms in her book. They were a sign of healthy soil, of life returning to earth that had been dead. She picked one up, felt its cool, smooth body against her palm, and cried. Actual tears streaming down her face. Because she knew that something was happening. But the real miracle came on a Thursday, 5 weeks after she'd buried her first apple. Elara was in the backyard after school, watering her patches as usual, when she noticed something that made her drop the watering can. There, in the spot where she'd buried that very first apple, was a tiny green shoot. no more than an inch tall, with two delicate leaves that trembled in the breeze. It was the most beautiful thing Elara had ever seen. She fell to her knees, not caring about the dirt, not caring about the dust, not caring about anything except that little green life in front of her. She touched it gently, her finger barely brushing against the leaf, and she felt a connection that she couldn't explain. This little plant had fought its way through hard clay, through dead soil, through conditions that should have killed it. And it had made it. It was alive. "You're going to be a tree someday," Elara whispered. "I promise." She ran inside to tell her mother, breathless with excitement. Clara was at the kitchen table, paying bills with a calculator and a worried expression that had become permanent over the years. "Mom! Mom! Something grew in the backyard! Come see!" Clara looked up, her eyes tired but softening at her daughter's enthusiasm. "What grew, sweetheart?" "A plant! From the apple! Come see!" Clara followed her daughter outside, expecting to find a weed or perhaps a patch of moss. But when she saw that tiny green shoot in the middle of the grey dirt, she stopped. Her hand went to her mouth, her eyes widened. "Elara," she breathed. "How did you?" "I buried the apples, Mom, the rotten ones. I buried them, and they're making the soil better, and now things can grow." Clara looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and saw something she hadn't noticed before. The dirt under Elara's fingernails wasn't just dirt. It was purpose. The faraway look in her eyes wasn't distraction. It was vision. And the strange behavior that everyone had dismissed as childish nonsense was actually something else. Something important. "I'll be darned," Clara whispered. And then she smiled. The first real smile Elara had seen on her mother's face in months. "I'll be absolutely darned." Word spread quickly in a town as small as Dusty Hollow. By the next day, half the town had heard about the Whitfield girl and her magic apple tree. Some people were curious, some were skeptical, and some, like Billy Kincaid's father, who had lost his own farm to the dying soil, were angry. "One little sprout doesn't mean anything," Mr. Kincaid said at the diner, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Kids plant seeds in cups at school all the time. Doesn't mean you can bring back dead land. The Whitfield girls just got everyone fooled with a weed, mark my words." But Elara didn't care what Mr. Kincaid said. She had her sprout, and that was enough. She doubled her efforts, collecting more rotten fruit than ever, burying it in new spots around the yard, watering and watching, and waiting with a patience that most adults couldn't understand. And the earth responded. By the end of the second month, there were 5 sprouts in the backyard. By the end of the third, there were 15 apple seedlings, peach seedlings, and something that Elara couldn't identify, but that grew with such vigour that it seemed to get taller every time she blinked. The soil was changing colour too, from dead grey to something richer, something darker, something that looked almost like the soil in her book's illustrations. The earthworms multiplied. Then came the ladybugs, the beetles, the tiny spiders that spun webs between the growing plants. The backyard was becoming an ecosystem, a tiny world of life in the middle of a dead town, and Elara was its architect, its guardian, its devoted servant. But the mockery didn't stop. If anything, it got worse as the plants grew taller. Because in Dusty Hollow, hope was dangerous. Hope made people uncomfortable. It reminded them of everything they'd lost, everything they'd given up on, everything they'd stopped believing in. And when a 9-year-old girl refused to accept the town's despair, it made the adults feel ashamed. "She's wasting water," Mrs. Grimes complained at the church potluck. "We're all rationing, and she's out there watering weeds every..." "Those aren't weeds," Clara said quietly, surprising herself with her own defiance. Those are fruit trees. My daughter is growing fruit trees in dead soil. The table went silent. Then Mrs. Miller laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. Fruit trees? Clara, honey, I know you want to believe in your girl, but fruit trees take years to grow, and they need good soil. Everyone knows the soil in Dusty Hollow is dead. Has been for decades. Maybe, Clara said, looking her neighbour in the eye. But my daughter didn't get the memo. That night, Clara did something she hadn't done in years. She went into the backyard after dark, carrying a flashlight, and she looked at her daughter's garden. Really looked at it. The plants were small. Yes, none taller than her knee, but they were undeniably healthy. Their leaves were dark green and glossy, their stems were sturdy, and the soil was alive. She could smell it, that rich, earthy scent that she remembered from her childhood, from before the drought, from when the land had still loved the people who lived on it. She sat down in the dirt, not caring about her dress, and she cried. Not sad tears, but something else. Tears of recognition, tears of remembering, tears of realizing that her daughter had found something that an entire town of adults had missed, that the land wasn't dead. It was just waiting, waiting for someone patient enough, stubborn enough, crazy enough to love it back to life. By the 6-month mark, Elara's backyard was unrecognizable. What had once been a rectangle of dead clay was now a garden. The plants had grown taller, some reaching Elara's waist, others brushing her shoulders. The apple tree, the first one, the one from that very first sprout, was nearly 4 feet tall, its branches spreading outward with the confidence of a tree that knew it belonged. But it wasn't just the trees that had transformed. The entire backyard had become something else. Vines had sprouted from seeds Elara didn't even know she'd planted, creeping along the fence and up the old oak tree, turning the skeletal branches green with life. Wildflowers had appeared, poppies and daisies, and something purple that Elara couldn't name, attracting butterflies that no one in Dusty Hollow had seen in years. The fence that had leaned to the left was now covered in morning glory, its blue and white flowers opening each dawn like nature's own alarm clock. The ground, which had been hard enough to crack a shovel, was now soft and dark, teeming with life. When Elara walked across it, her feet sank slightly, the earth yielding beneath her weight like a welcome mat, and the air in the backyard was different. Cooler, fresher. It smelled of green things and growing things and life. In a town where the wind usually carried dust and despair, Elara's backyard was an oasis, but still the town resisted. Still they laughed. Still they called her names and shook their heads and warned their children not to get too close to that Whitfield girl and her crazy ideas. It was the drought that finally changed everything. In late spring of Elara's 10th year, the drought that had plagued Dusty Hollow for 2 decades reached its breaking point. The town well ran dry. The creek that had once flowed behind the schoolhouse became a ribbon of cracked mud. Even the hardy sagebrush began to wither, turning from grey-green to brown. The town council held an emergency meeting in the church basement, the only space large enough to hold the remaining residents. The verdict was grim. Without water, Dusty Hollow couldn't survive. People would have to leave. The town would become a ghost town, another casualty of the changing climate, another forgotten place on the map of American despair. Jed Whitfield came home from that meeting with his shoulders more bent than Elara had ever seen them. He sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, and told his family the news. "We have 3 months," he said quietly. 3 months before the water trucks stop coming. After that, we either find water or we leave. Leave? Clara's voice was barely a whisper. Jed, this is our home. This is where my parents are buried. This is where Elara was born. I know, Jed said, his voice breaking. But what choice do we have? The land is dead, Clara. It has been for years. We can't make it rain. Elara listened from the doorway, her heart pounding. She looked out the window at her backyard, at the green oasis she'd created in the middle of the desert, and an idea began to form. An impossible idea. A crazy idea. The kind of idea that only a child who had spent a year burying rotten fruit in dead soil could have. The land isn't dead, Dad, she said, stepping into the kitchen. Jed looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and tired. Elara, I know you want to believe that, but it's not dead, she insisted, her voice stronger than she'd ever heard it. I've been fixing it. The soil in our backyard. It's alive now. It can hold water. It can grow things. If we can do it in our backyard, we can do it everywhere. Sweetheart, Jed said gently, our backyard is 30 by 40 feet. The town needs thousands of acres. It's not the same. Not yet, Elara said. But what if everyone helped? What if everyone buried their rotten fruit? What if everyone composted? What if we all worked together to fix the soil? Jed and Clara exchanged a look. It was the look of parents who loved their child desperately, but knew that the world didn't work the way she thought it did. It was the look of people who had been disappointed so many times that they couldn't afford to hope again. Elara, Clara said softly, that's a beautiful idea, but people don't change. Not like that. Not in time. Then I'll show them, Elara said. And she turned and walked out of the kitchen, her small figure disappearing into the backyard that had become her kingdom. For the next 3 months, Elara worked harder than she ever had. She expanded her garden, digging up new sections of the backyard, burying more fruit, planting more seeds. She talked to her plants, sang to them, told them stories about the forest they would become. And they grew. They grew with a speed that defied explanation, as if the earth itself was trying to help her prove her point. By midsummer, the apple tree was taller than Elara, its branches heavy with leaves that rustled in the wind like applause. The peach tree was nearly as tall, and the mysterious vine had completely covered the oak tree, turning it from a skeleton into a green giant. Wildflowers carpeted the ground in patches of colour, so vivid they seemed unreal. Red and yellow and purple and white. A rainbow that had fallen from the sky and decided to stay. But the most important change was invisible. The soil in Elara's backyard had been transformed from dead clay into something that could sustain life. It was dark and crumbly, full of organic matter, able to absorb and retain moisture. When it rained, and it did rain, twice that summer, brief showers that the old soil would have rejected, letting the water run off into the dust. Elara's backyard soaked it up like a sponge. She measured the moisture levels with a homemade device she'd created from a stick and a string, marking the depth each day. The soil in her backyard held water 3 times longer than the soil in the front yard. 3 times. In a drought, that was the difference between life and death. But still, the town didn't believe. Still, they prepared to leave. Moving trucks began appearing on Elm Street, loaded with furniture and boxes and the last remnants of lives that had been built on hope, and were now being dismantled by despair. Billy Kincaid's family was one of the first to go. On their last day in Dusty Hollow, Billy stood at the fence of Elara's backyard, watching her water her plants with the careful precision of a surgeon. He was different now, quieter, smaller somehow, as if the move had already started shrinking him. "My dad says you're crazy," Billy said, not looking at her. "He says none of this matters, that we're all leaving, and your stupid garden will die without you." Elara looked up, surprised. Billy had never spoken to her without mockery before. "Maybe," she said, "but maybe not." Billy finally looked at her, and Elara saw something she hadn't expected. Not anger, not cruelty. Fear. Billy Kincaid was scared. Scared of leaving the only home he'd ever known. Scared of starting over somewhere else. Scared that his father was right, that nothing mattered, that hope was just a lie told to children. "What if he's wrong?" Billy asked, his voice barely audible. What if the soil really can be fixed?" Elara set down her watering can and walked to the fence. She reached through the slats and took Billy's hand, pressing it into the dirt of her garden. "Feel that?" she asked. Billy nodded, his eyes wide. "That's alive," Elara said. "That's soil that remembers how to grow things. Your dad thinks the land is dead because he stopped trying to save it. But I didn't. And it isn't." Billy pulled his hand back, looking at the dark soil on his palm. For a moment, Elara thought she saw something change in his face, a flicker of something that might have been hope. But then he wiped his hand on his jeans and turned away. "Bye, fruit girl," he said, walking toward the moving truck, and then, so quietly that Elara almost missed it, "I'm sorry." The Kincaid family left that afternoon, their truck kicking up a cloud of dust that settled over Dusty Hollow like a shroud. More families followed. The Miller twins, the Grimes family, even Mrs. Jenkins, who had lived on Elm Street for 40 years, packed her bags and drove away without looking back. By the end of the second month, Dusty Hollow was half empty. The school closed. There weren't enough students left to justify keeping it open. The grocery store cut its hours, then closed entirely. The diner, the hardware store, the gas station. One by one, they boarded up their windows and turned off their lights. The Whitfields were one of the few families that stayed. Jed had found work doing remote repairs for a shop in the next county, driving an hour each way but managing to keep food on the table. Clara started tutoring the remaining children in town, using their living room as a makeshift classroom. And Elara kept gardening, but now something had shifted. The few families that remained had started watching her, not with mockery anymore, but with something else. Curiosity. Desperation. The kind of look that people get when they've tried everything else and are willing to try anything, no matter how crazy it seems. It was old Mr. Henderson who approached her first. Mr. Henderson had been a rancher before the drought, with 300 acres of land that had once supported cattle and horses. Now his ranch was a dust bowl, his animals sold or dead, his fences falling down from neglect. "I've been watching you, little girl," he said one evening, leaning on her fence with hands that trembled slightly. "I've been watching your garden, and I have to ask, how?" Elara looked up from where she was planting a new row of peach pits. "How what? How did you make the soil come back?" "I've tried everything, fertilizers, chemicals, irrigation. Nothing worked. But you buried garbage in the ground, and now look at it." Elara wiped her hands on her overalls and walked to the fence. "It's not garbage," she said gently. "It's food. For the soil." The soil was hungry, Mr. Henderson. It was starving. All those years of chemicals and drought. They killed the things that make soil alive. The bacteria, the fungi, the earthworms. I just gave them something to eat. Mr. Henderson stared at her, his weathered face unreadable. "And that's it? Just feed the soil?" "That's the start," Elara said. "Then you have to be patient. And you have to believe. The soil knows when you believe in it." Mr. Henderson was quiet for a long time. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something that made Elara's heart skip. A key. An old rusted key on a leather cord. "This is the key to my ranch," he said. placing it in Elara's small palm. 300 acres. It's yours. Do what you did here. Fix it, please. Elara looked at the key, then at Mr. Henderson, then at her mother who had come to the door and was watching with tears in her eyes. I'll need help, Elara said. You've got it, Mr. Henderson replied. And for the first time in 20 years, his voice held something that sounded like hope. What happened next was something that people would talk about for generations. Something that would be written about in agricultural journals and environmental textbooks. Something that would transform a dying town into a symbol of what was possible when you refused to give up on the earth. Elara, with her key and her knowledge and her unshakable belief, began to transform Mr. Henderson's ranch. But she didn't do it alone. The remaining families of Dusty Hollow, the ones who had stayed, who had watched, who had finally decided to hope, joined her. They collected rotten fruit from grocery stores in neighbouring towns. They gathered fallen leaves and grass clippings and vegetable scraps. They buried it all across Mr. Henderson's land, creating a massive composting operation that would have seemed insane to anyone who didn't understand what Elara understood. The work was hard. The sun was merciless. The soil was harder than concrete in some places, and digging holes large enough to bury the organic matter required tools and muscles that the small group struggled to provide. But they kept going, because for the first time in decades, Dusty Hollow had a purpose. For the first time in decades, they weren't just waiting to die. Jed Whitfield used his mechanical skills to build a simple irrigation system from scrap parts, directing what little water they had to the areas where the compost was richest. Clara organised the volunteers, creating schedules and meal plans and making sure everyone had what they needed. And Elara was everywhere, walking the land, checking the soil, adjusting the compost piles, teaching anyone who would listen about the invisible world beneath their feet. We're not just planting fruit, she told the small group one evening, as they sat around a fire made from the old ranch's fallen fence posts. We're planting the future. Every piece of organic matter we bury is a promise to the earth that we haven't given up on it. And the earth keeps its promises. It just takes time. The first results came after 4 months. Small patches of green appeared in the composted areas, not the tough, wiry grass that had managed to survive the drought, but soft, lush growth that looked like it belonged in a different world. The soil in those areas began to change colour, from grey to brown to something approaching black. By the 8-month mark, the transformation was visible from the road. Where there had been dust and desolation, there were now patches of green. Where there had been cracked earth, there was soft soil. And where there had been hopelessness, there was a community working together towards something bigger than themselves. But the real miracle, the moment that would change everything, came on a Tuesday morning in early spring, exactly 1 year after Elara had buried her first apple. She was walking the land with Mr. Henderson, checking the newest compost piles, when she stopped. There, in the middle of a field that had been barren for 2 decades, was a tree. Not a sapling, not a sprout, but a real tree. 10 feet tall, with a trunk as thick as Elara's arm and branches that spread outward in a canopy of green. It was an apple tree, heavy with white and pink blossoms that filled the air with a scent so sweet it made Elara dizzy. Mr. Henderson fell to his knees. He didn't say anything. He just knelt there in the dirt, his hands pressed against the ground, tears streaming down his weathered face. Elara knelt beside him, putting her small arm around his broad shoulders. And together, they sat in the shade of a tree that shouldn't have existed. Word spread. This time, It didn't spread through the gossip of a small town. It spread through newspapers, through television stations, through the internet, where videos of a 10-year-old girl standing beside a blooming apple tree in the middle of a desert went viral overnight. Scientists came to Dusty Hollow. Environmentalists came. Agricultural experts who had spent their careers studying soil degradation came to see what a child had accomplished with nothing more than rotten fruit and determination. They tested the soil. They analysed the compost. They studied the microorganisms that had returned to the land, and they confirmed what Elara had known all along: that dead soil could be revived, that organic matter could restore what chemicals had destroyed, that patience and belief were just as important as science and technology. But the most important visitors were the ones who came with empty hands and broken hearts. Farmers from across the country who had lost their land to drought and degradation. Families who had been forced to leave homes that had been in their families for generations. Children who had never seen a green field, who had grown up in a world where the earth was something to be feared rather than loved. They came to Dusty Hollow to learn, to see, to believe again. And Elara taught them. She stood in front of crowds that grew from dozens to hundreds to thousands, her braids still lopsided, her knees still dirty. And she told them the simple truth that had transformed a dead town into a living miracle. "The earth isn't dead," she said, her voice clear and strong despite her small frame. "It's just sleeping, and like anyone who's been asleep for a long time, it needs patience to wake up. It needs care, it needs food, and most of all, it needs someone to believe it's still alive." She showed them her journals, the ones she'd kept since that first apple, filled with observations and measurements and the kind of detail have impressed professional scientists. She walked them through the process: how to compost, how to build soil, how to work with nature instead of against it. She made it sound simple because it was simple. The hard part wasn't the technique. The hard part was believing it would work when everyone else told you it wouldn't. By the time Elara turned 11, Dusty Hollow had been transformed. Not just the land, but the town itself. New families had moved in, drawn by the promise of a community that had figured out how to survive. New businesses had opened: a nursery, a farm supply store, a cafe that served food grown in the revitalized soil. The school had reopened, with 30 students and a new teacher who had read about Dusty Hollow in a magazine and decided this was where she wanted to make a difference. The old oak tree in Elara's backyard, the one that had been half dead, its branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers, was now completely covered in vines and surrounded by a garden so lush it looked like something from a dream. Apple trees, peach trees, cherry trees, all bearing fruit that was sweeter than anything sold in stores. Wildflowers that attracted butterflies and bees and birds that hadn't been seen in the area for years. And soil, rich, dark, living soil that could grow anything. But the transformation went deeper than the land. The people of Dusty Hollow had changed too. They had learned to see waste as resource, to see problems as possibilities, to see dead things as merely sleeping. They had learned that the most powerful force on earth wasn't technology or money or even water. It was belief. The stubborn, irrational, beautiful belief that things could get better if you were willing to work for them. Jed Whitfield quit his job at the garage and started a farm on the land he'd once thought was dead. He woke up every morning before dawn, his hands in the soil, his heart full of something he hadn't felt in years: pride, purpose, hope. Clara started a school program that taught children about soil science and composting, using Elara's journals as the curriculum. Her students didn't just learn about growing things. They learned about resilience, about patience, about the power of small actions to create big changes. And Elara kept gardening. But now she wasn't just gardening in her backyard or on Mr. Henderson's ranch. She was gardening in the hearts of everyone who came to Dusty Hollow seeking a miracle. She was planting seeds of hope in people who had forgotten how to dream. She was growing a forest of belief in a world that desperately needed it. The last time anyone laughed at Elara Whitfield was the day before the news crews came. A group of teenagers from the city, visiting on a school trip, had snickered when they saw her kneeling in the dirt, her hands covered in compost, talking to a tomato plant like it was her best friend. "Look at the crazy farm girl," one of them said, loud enough for her to hear. "Talking to vegetables. What a weirdo." Elara looked up, smiled, and went back to her work. She didn't need to defend herself anymore. She didn't need to explain, because anyone with eyes could see what she had built. Anyone with a heart could feel what she had done. And then she stood up, brushed the dirt from her knees, and walked to the edge of her property, where a sign had been posted by the town council. It read, "Welcome to Dusty Hollow. Population growing." Below that, in smaller letters, was a quote that Elara had written herself. Everyone laughed when a little girl buried rotten fruit in her backyard. They called her crazy. They said nothing would grow. But she kept digging. She kept believing. And then they saw her jungle. 10 years later, Dusty Hollow was unrecognizable. What had once been a dying town in the middle of a dust bowl was now a thriving community, surrounded by thousands of acres of green. The techniques that Elara had developed, simple, organic, patient, had been adopted by communities around the world facing similar challenges. Agricultural schools taught her methods. Environmental organizations used her story as proof that restoration was possible. And children who had never seen a forest planted their first seeds with her picture on their classroom walls. Elara was 19 now, studying environmental science at a university that had offered her a full scholarship after reading about her work. But she came home every summer, every break, every chance she got, because Dusty Hollow wasn't just where she was from. It was who she was. It was the place that had taught her that miracles don't happen. They're grown, one seed at a time, one shovel of compost at a time, one act of stubborn belief at a time. On her last visit before graduating, Elara walked through the forest that had grown from her backyard. The apple tree, that first apple tree, the one from the very first buried fruit, was now 30 feet tall, its branches spreading across the yard like a protective umbrella. Beneath it, she had placed a bench, and she sat there now, watching the sunlight filter through the leaves, listening to the birds that had made her jungle their home. Her mother found her there, as she often did. Clara was older now, her hair streaked with grey, but her smile was the same one that had appeared when she'd seen that first sprout so many years ago. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd stopped?" Clara asked, sitting beside her daughter on the bench. "If you'd listened to Billy Kincaid and all the others who told you it was impossible." Elara was quiet for a moment, watching a butterfly land on a wildflower near her feet. "I couldn't stop, Mum," she said finally. "Because stopping would have meant they were right. It would have meant that the land really was dead. That hope really was a lie. And I couldn't live in a world like that. So I kept digging. Not because I knew it would work, but because I couldn't bear the thought of not trying." Clara took her daughter's hand, The same small hand that had once held a bent spoon and dug a hole no bigger than a fist. You changed the world, Elara. Not just our town, the whole world. Elara shook her head. I didn't change the world, Mum. I just refused to give up on it. There's a difference. They sat in silence, mother and daughter, beneath the apple tree that had started it all. Around them, the jungle rustled and breathed and lived. A jungle that had grown from rot and despair and the stubborn belief of a little girl who had seen a sprout in a cracked alley and dared to imagine what could happen if someone cared enough to try. And somewhere, in another dying town, in another patch of dead soil, in another heart that was beginning to forget what hope felt like, a child was finding a rotten piece of fruit, looking at it not as garbage, but as possibility, and making a choice that would change everything, because that's how jungles are born. Not from perfect conditions or ideal circumstances or the approval of others, but from the courage to plant something in the dark and believe, really believe, that the light will find it. Everyone laughed when a little girl buried rotten fruit in her backyard. But she didn't laugh. She dug. She waited. She believed. And in the end, she didn't just grow a jungle. She grew a revolution.